An interaction system is the core foundation of every single video game, whether it's as simple as a point and click old game from the 90s or as complicated as I have to draw out this specific rune in the air to match some kind of spell that I want to cast. You need a way for your players to interact with your world. Today we're going to be looking at how to make a very simple interaction system, much along the lines of that kind of point and click example, where your player will look at something, click, and whatever event you want will fire on the object. Now, quick tip, I also like this system for debugging. I'm primarily a VR developer, and it's nice to not always have to pop in the headset and do whatever complicated, physical button pushing or moving around my space that I would have to do normally if I just want to debug a small system. So without further ado, let's get into things in Unreal. I'm in the VR example, just because, as I said, I'm primarily a VR developer, but this will be mostly geared at looking at the first-person template. A follow-up video will be made later for my fellow VR enthusiasts, and I will show you how to hook this up for some more VR-specific interactions. So, first, we need to tell the system how to know if we are looking at an object. And even before that, we need the system to know what objects we want to interact with and which ones we don't care about. So to do that, we're going to make this a component-driven system, meaning all I have to do to say, hey, I want this ball or this gun or this block to be interactable, is add a new component to the actor, whether it's in the world or whether it's via a blueprint. So let's go ahead and get started. I've already made us an interaction system folder. I have a finished version here just to make sure I knew what I was doing before I dove into this. But we're going to go ahead and start with a new blueprint class, and we want it to be a scene component. This is because we're going to build this in such a way where multiple different meshes in one actor can be interacted with separately, just for convenience. So I'm going to do com_interactable. And that naming convention is component scene, because this is a scene component. We're going to jump in here. First thing we're going to do, we won't need tick, but we will need event begin play. We'll leave that on there for later. And we're going to go ahead and set up some event dispatchers. This way we will be able to bind events in our primary actor to things that happen in this actor very easily. So I want a on hover, on unhover, and then we're going to do on interact. And I'm also going to add an input here, a Boolean input for is, let's call this is on started. This will make a little bit more sense when we see how we're hooking this up. But if you've ever worked with the enhanced input system, then this should make some sense. Basically, this will allow us to determine when we call this OnInteract dispatcher, whether this is the kind of setup to our interaction or whether this is a ticking interaction. And then the last thing we're going to want for now is OnInteract ended. All right, so let's go ahead and start with our begin play node. We're going to go ahead and set it up so that where this interactable needs to be attached to some kind of mesh, either a static mesh like a cube or a cylinder or a sphere or whatever have you, or a skeletal mesh like a hand, a gun sometimes, or a human body. And that's because we want to kind of get some, I want to show off how to set up an overlay material with it, just as kind of an example for hovering and as a good way of showing the player feedback. So what we're going to do is we are going to need to get our attached parent. And we are going to cast to mesh component. And this is the parent class of the static mesh and skeletal mesh. So basically, if it's attached to a static mesh or a skeletal mesh, this will succeed and cast correctly. We're going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. We're going to call it mesh parent so we can access it later. Now, it's always good to have something happen when it failed. And in our case, we want to just throw an error. So we're going to do raise script error. And this will pop up in our message log if we've done something wrong, which I'll showcase in a little bit. And we want it to say, we want to give ourselves as much detail as possible. So we're actually going to do an append, and we want it to say, this interaction component on, and then we're going to get our owning actor, just so again we have a little bit more debugging feedback for ourselves, and we're going to get the display name of it, is not attached to a mesh. So let's see that in action here. So we're going to grab our, let's see, what's a good way to do this? Our VR spectator camera over here. This doesn't have any mesh components on it. Well, it does, but we won't attach them. We'll attach the scene root here, and we're going to attach our s interactable. Make sure that is on the scene root and not the camera mesh, just to show this error. If I go ahead and click play and stop, we're going to see errors warnings reported. If I drag my message log from my other window, we'll see our error message. This interaction component on VR Spectator is not attached to a mesh. And what's really nice about this, as opposed to a simple print statement, is one, it'll pop up without a warning, meaning it's a little bit more enforced and harder to miss. But also, we can see exactly where this is going wrong. We can see the exact node that is throwing our error and follow our logic to see what's going on there. Whereas, if we attach it to the actual mesh component and we play, no errors happening because this cast is resolving successfully. All right, now to get to the actual coding part. We need to know when our player, in this case our first person character, is hovering over our component. So we're going to do a trace on tick. I'm going to go our event tick here, and we're going to do a visibility trace. Remember what it's called? Oh, trace by channel. We want a line trace by channel. And we are going to always want to start from the camera's perspective, since that's what we're seeing out of. We're going to get the world location of our camera here. And that's going to be our start location. Now for end location, we want to follow the direction the camera is looking. So we're going to get forward vector. And we're going to multiply this by a float, in this case 800, meaning it will follow the direction the camera is looking 800 units. And then to make sure that it is starting from this same position, we will add it to our world location. So basically this is saying start our trace at our world location and end it 800 units away from the camera in the direction of our camera. And if anything is in the way of that, it will give us a hit. Oops, that's not what I wanted. We don't want to turn that into a variable. We want a branch statement, because we want to make sure that we only do something when we actually have a valid hit here. Also for debugging, I'm going to do a 1 frame. Now we're going to break our hit result. And we are going to get the hit component. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this to see if whatever component we're hitting has our interactable on it, but we're going to use tags because it's simple. So we're going to say has tag. And I'm going to just say the interactable tag. And this can be whatever we want. This is custom defined. And we're about to set it up in our component. Because right now, by default, our mesh parent will not have any tags. So we need to go ahead and get one of tags. And then we are going to add a new tag to that array. We will add the interactable tag. I just copied that exact text from here. Now we're going to do another branch coming out from here. And to just make sure that works, we're going to do a print string. And we can just have it say hello for now. This is just to show us some kind of visual feedback to say, yes, we are hitting something that is interactable. But for that to work, we have to put the interactable on something. So I'm going to do this top cube here. And we are going to do add our interactable component. And now when I hover over that, it says hello. If I give it a second and hover over something else, it doesn't. Now also note that I'm hovering over more of these cubes, but because I only put the component on this top cube here, this is the only one that is firing our hello print there. All right. So now that we know that our component is interactable, we need to actually get the interactable component that is attached to this component. Because remember, this is our mesh here. This is not actually our interactable component, because our interactable component doesn't have any kind of collision geometry. There'd be no way for us to actually hit our interactable component itself. So what we're going to do is we are going to get children components. This will get every component attached to our hit component. And we are going to turn this into its own little function called get interactable comp. You can see I've already built this function here when I was testing earlier. So we're going to call this our component. And now we are going to loop through this array. To see if this child that we're looking at right now is our com_s interactable. If it is, then we want to return out of our function, and we will return our interactable comp. All right, and then the last little thing here is, just for ease, I'm going to make this pure, which means it'll be like this kind of green function here with no exit pins, as opposed to something like a for loop that has to have an execution pin go through it. Just make our code a little bit cleaner. All right. Now we are going to store this as a variable. And we are going to call this, just going to delete my old variable there, current interactable comp. And now we need to run a couple of tests to make sure and see which events we should be firing to our interactable component. So we have a couple of different cases here. Case one is we have never interacted with any other component. We have not hovered over anything ever before. And so we need to send just the hover event to our current interaction component. Situation two is we are currently hovering over something that is interactable. And so we need to send the unhover event to that interactable first before we can send the hover event to the new interactable. Like if we were to hover over one box and then move our camera to the next box. We can tell the first box to unhover before we can tell the second box to hover. And then the third situation is that we are no longer hovering over an interactable component at all, and we need to tell the last interactable to unhover and then clear our reference to it. So let's go ahead and get started on that. First thing, to test that first example, we're just going to do a get valid. So I did a get by dragging out while holding the control key, dropping. And then I right-clicked and I said convert to validated get. So if there is no valid interactable component, we are going to set our current interactable component to the one that we are now hovering over, and then send the hover event, which I have not made. So that's my bad. Let's go ahead and create some custom events here. Remember what the node is called, custom event. Call hover. And we're also going to make the unhover event. And we'll define some logic for these in a second. So we can call hover now that it actually exists. But if we already had a valid component, then we actually need to check and make sure that we are not hovering over the same component. Because remember, this runs every tick, right? So whenever this fires, we need to say, hey, are these the same thing? Because we only want something to happen if they are not the same thing. So we're going to do a not equals. We're going to say, is our current interactive component not the same as the new one that we're hovering over? Don't want whatever that is. Let's get a simple branch there. There we go. And so if they are in fact different, then we're first going to call unhover on the old interactive component. And then we are going to fire this logic here to set our interactable to the new thing we're hovering over, and then call the hover event on it. Now, the last situation, while I clean this things up, is to say that we are no longer hovering over any sort of interactive component at all. And if that's the case, then first we need to make sure that we were at some point hovering over an interactable. And if we are, we can call unhover and invalidate it just by doing a set and not feeding anything into the pin. All right, so we should be in pretty good shape here. This logic should work, but right now it won't do anything because our hover and unhover events are not hooked up. So let's go ahead and hook those up. We're going to get a reference to our mesh parent, and we are going to set overlay material both on hover and unhover. On unhover is easy. We're just going to set it to nothing. So we're going to make sure that this says select asset here and not any kind of material. And here for our on hover, I made one earlier. Let me go ahead and find it. Very simple hover material. We've set it to translucent gray transmittance. For anyone unfamiliar with the new substrate style of material, this is basically just translucent. And we've set it to unlit because we want it to be a little bit glowy and we don't want to have to deal with any of the additional calculation that needs to happen if it were to interact and receive shadows and lights. We just want it to emit. So we've done a Fresnel. What this will do is just get the edges. And note this will work better on round objects than it will flat objects. Notice how this is pretty opaque all the way around. This has a nice kind of soft fade from centered outline. And then we've created a color parameter. All right, so we're going to set on hover. Our overlay material is that hover outline material, and then unhover is going to be nothing. So let's also go ahead and let's add a interactable component to every single one of these cubes here. The way we're going to do that is just by editing their blueprint and adding an interactable component to their static mesh. And these grabbable small cubes come by default with the VR template, but if you're not working in VR, all this is a cube static mesh with a small scale, some kind of material that is simulating physics. So now if I play, you'll notice that whatever I'm hovering over lights up, and when I stop hovering over anything, they all stop lighting up, which is great. That's basically what we want. So now let's go ahead and make it so I can actually click on them. So to do this, I'm going to need a new enhanced input action that detects when I just click with my mouse, or if you're on controller, maybe press the A button or the trigger or whatever. We'll build it in a way where you can assign any key you want. So to make a new input, we're going to go into the handily named input folder under actions, and we are going to create a new input action. So it's going to be IA_interact. And the default settings are fine, but just to make sure, the value type should be a bool. None of these should be checked, and we don't want any additional triggers or modifiers. Now we can go ahead and add that to our IMC or input mapping context default. And we're going to add our wrong thing, interact to the mappings. Now to make it work when I click the left mouse button, all I'm going to do is select that and left mouse button. Now also, just for demonstration purposes, show how to hook it up to, let's say, the A button on a controller. So I'm going to go to Gamepad, and then I want Gamepad face button bottom. I'm thinking in terms of Xbox here, so A button would be the bottom. I believe this would be X on PlayStation and B on Nintendo. If I'm remembering right. I only have an Xbox controller in front of me, I must admit. So let's go back into our first person template here, or sorry, our first person character blueprint. And because we have already in the controller set up our enhanced input action, all we have to do here is add that new action. Or sorry, in the controller we assign the mapping context, so that here we just have to assign the action. So I'm going to do IA underscore interact. Make sure to get the event, not the value. And so we have a couple of things here. We've started and triggered. So just like our hover, to be able to respond to this in our interactable component, I'm going to go ahead and do a custom event. And we're going to do on interact start. Just for a little bit of clarity, I'm actually going to rename this to interact tick and interact end. These are going to call our bindings. So interact start is going to call the interact with on started set to true. Interact tick is going to call our interact binding with on started false, and then we can call our interact ended on interact end. And while I'm in here, I'll go ahead and set up the dispatches for hover and unhover. So call hover here and call unhover here. And again, these dispatches are here so that we can subscribe to these events in our actual cube. And I'll show what that looks like in a minute. But first, let's go ahead and make it so we can actually interact. We're going to get our current interactable component and make sure that it's valid. On trigger, we're going to call interact tick. On start, we're going to call interact start. And then on canceled or completed, we're going to call interact end. Compile and save. And now this should all work, but we won't see it do anything because we haven't hooked up these dispatchers to anything on our cube. So let's go ahead and let's just make it very simply so that the cube gets set to a random color when we click it. So in our construction script, we are going to drag out our static mesh, and we are going to create dynamic material instance. And I'm going to set this to, it's called the colorway material. But just to make sure you non-VR people know how that material is working, let's go and open it up. I said open it up, Unreal. Thank you. We'll go ahead and go through the chain here. All this really is saying there is a base color, a metallic, and a roughness value. So we want to set the base color. So we're going to promote this to a variable and call this cube matte. Now, we can right click on our interactable, add the OnInteract event. We want this to be only when it starts. We're going to grab our cube matte, set vector parameter value. Make sure we get our name right, which is base space color. So base color. And let's get random hue. All right, this requires that we have a variable, annoyingly, honestly, in my opinion. So what we're going to do here is we're going to promote to variable cube cube color. And we're going to plug this in both places. In case you don't know, this little diamond symbol here means that it is a reference to it. So anything that is happening to the variable fed in through here will directly modify the variable itself, which is why we don't have to set anything here, because this is dealing with setting our variable. Compile it, and just for consistency's sake, we'll make it kind of purple, since that is kind of the default color. And now, let's see if that worked. So I'm going to click on this cube. Now it's blue. And whenever I click on these cubes, they change colors. All right. So that's it for the basics of our tutorial. In case you're curious, I also have the third-person template in here. So just kind of as a review, I'm going to go over how to hook it up to our third-person template, just to show how modular this system really is. But if this is all you came for, then you are free to go. Thank you so much for watching. If you found the tutorial helpful, please feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, all the good stuff. But in case you're curious, let's go ahead and set this up to the third-person template. I'm going to go to third-person, blueprints character, and we can literally just copy-paste pretty much everything from our first person. So just copying this event tick. Now notice that we don't have the interactable comp function, so we're going to create a matching function in our blueprint. And we don't have a first person camera because we're in third person, so instead we're going to get the follow camera, because the follow camera is a little bit farther behind. We're also going to increase this to, I think, 1200 is good. And we want to make sure that we create a variable for our interaction component. And then last but not least, let's go into our get interactable comp here. We're going to make sure it's pure. And we'll go back into our first person and just copy that code. Oops, missed a note. Copy that code into our third person character. Now while I'm copying this, something that eagle-eyed viewers may have noted is that this function can very much return an invalid response, which our program does not handle. And that is true. If cast fails, this interactable comp reference will be invalid. The reason we're not concerned is before we're calling this function, we're checking if it has the tag. And the kind of assumption we're making here is that we're not going to give the interactable tag to anything that does not already have an interactable component. So it's a little trick there. Only account for what you need to account for. Now let's go ahead and make sure this works with our third person template. So I'm going to switch to the third person game mode. Save. And now I'm my third person character. Now we can see the camera is a little bit freaking out here, isn't it? Now I will admit that I kind of thought this would just work and I didn't test this part. So let's go through some troubleshooting steps together. First thing, we're going to make sure we are in fact getting our follow camera. That's good. It is behind the player. All right. So what I'm curious here, and what's kind of throwing me off, is the fact that it looks like this line is not exactly following the character. And it looks like, okay. So I know a solution here. What we really want, because the camera is always going to be looking directly at our third person character, we want to know what it would be like if our third person character was looking from our camera. That doesn't make much sense, so let me do this instead. Instead of getting the world position of our follow camera, we want to get the location of the head for our mesh, because we basically want to do a line trace from here. So to keep things simple, I'm going to add a scene component called trace start. Make sure it's attached to our mesh, and then we're going to attach it to the head bone. And we'll bring it a little bit forward. Should be good. It's erroring because we forgot to actually hook that back up. We'll just plug our trace start to the world location. So now our trace will start from our head and go in the direction of our camera, which also means we can turn this back down. And there we go. So now when we click on things, they're not doing anything because we did not add in that interaction component, or sorry, the interaction event. All we have to do in our first person character, grab that code, go into our third person character, and paste it in. And again, because these are both using the same input mapping context, this should all just work fine. So let's go ahead and click on one of these cubes. And as we can see, it's working. Now, it's a little bit janky. You might want to hook it up a little bit differently in your own camera logic. But for kind of demonstration purposes, kind of showing that this system can be used by multiple different schema, be it third person, first person, or VR, which we will showcase in the next video since it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more niche. I think it works fine. So thank you again for watching. If you stuck around through this last part, I hope it helped kind of showing how I like to debug things, go through, think about things a little bit farther. And yeah, please feel free to leave any questions in the comment below. And if you like this tutorial, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the bell so you'll see when future videos from me come out. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Happy unreeling.